Welcome back to the Invest in Yourself podcast. Today's guest is Rick Porrello. He is an author, drummer, and former police chief. Rick's family was involved with the Cleveland Mafia. His grandfather was Joe Porrello, who was the boss of the Cleveland Mafia at one time. Rick wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia. That is mainly today's topic. We talk about Rick's family being involved with the Cleveland Mafia. This is a really interesting interview. There's not a lot known about the Cleveland Mafia, so Rick is definitely a good source when it comes to learning about the Cleveland Mafia. Please subscribe to my channel if you want to get more interviews like this. And without further ado, let's get into Rick's story. Hey Rick, how you doing?
Good, real good, Adrian. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on, man. I really enjoyed your book, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, Corn, Sugar, and Blood. I really enjoyed it, man. I left a great review, and that's what I really want to get into with you today, talking about what your family connection was to the Cleveland Mafia, and what made you want to write this book.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be here. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, there's a lot that went into that because of the family connection, as you can guess. So the question, what made me want to, if you want to get right into that, what made me want to write that book? I can tell you when I was a kid, probably maybe 10 years old, I heard, little bits and pieces on occasion that my grandfather had been murdered. And of course, if you're 10 years old, you hear that your grandfather had been murdered, your ears perk up, right? That's a big deal. Yeah. But there weren't many details. The only thing that I heard was that it had to do with the mob. It had something to do with the mob. He had been murdered, and that was really all there was. But that planted a seed. And maybe a couple of years later, I was rooting around through the house one day, and we had a bookshelf. There weren't a whole lot of books on it, but there was a book called The Mobs and the Mafia by Hank Messick, a journalist. And I was flipping through the book, and I was looking in the index, and I found the Porrello name in the index, and I was kind of surprised. It was spelled wrong. There was only one R in it, but I went to the page, and I was able to read a couple of paragraphs about the Porrellos in Cleveland, which was my grandfather and his 6 brothers. There were 7 brothers that came from a town in Sicily called Licata, Sicily. And I learned that not only had my grandfather been murdered, but 3 of his brothers were killed during Prohibition between 1930 and 1932.
Wow.
So it was. I mean, that planted a, that kind of, fertilized that seed that was already up there. And then a lot of time went by, and I grew up in a house filled with drummers. My father was a drummer, and my brother is 9 years older, Ray. He is a drummer, so there were drums all around. And so I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and I started picking up the drums and playing. And as soon as I was old enough, I started learning from my father and learning from my brother. So I basically became a drummer, and maybe 12, 13 years old, I started taking lessons, basically following in my brother's footsteps. And fast forward into high school, I was, I think, 15 years old. I was in high school, and my father had a very close friend. His name was Louis Belson. He was a great internationally known drummer, kind of like Buddy Rich, but not quite as well known. Damn. He was married to the great actress and entertainer Pearl Bailey. And he had become very close with my father. My father met him in Cleveland. And then later, my father became an official with the Musicians Union. He was the head business agent. And his business took him backstage to the Cleveland theaters and in the major venues where he met a lot of entertainers and their agents. So he became well connected in the entertainment industry and had a lot of business connections. And so he, when my brother was old enough, he started going on the road with some significant entertainers, and eventually got a job through the recommendation of Louis Belson with Sammy Davis Jr. The great, he was Mr. Entertainment, the greatest entertainer in the world. He was billed as. And by this time, I had, while I was in high school, entered the Louis Belson Slingerland Drum Contest. It was a national drum contest while I was in high school, and I was 15, and I won the local competition. Then I went to the regional competition in uh, Erie, Pennsylvania, and then the local was in Erie, Pennsylvania. Then the regional was in Columbus. I won that, and then went to the semifinals in Las Vegas, and I wound up coming in fourth place across the country. So that was
Wow.
a big deal. So I was kind of set, but I had this other dream. We talked about that a little bit before we started. I had this dream of getting involved in police work, and it was kind of alien to my family because nobody
I
uh,
would imagine.
really was involved in police work, except I did have one cousin on my mother's side who had fairly recently got involved in police work where we lived in Cleveland Heights, which was one of Cleveland's biggest suburbs and kind of a busy suburb. And I got involved in police work because one Christmas I asked to receive a police radio, this radio that you could kind of like a scanner, but you could tune in calls. And with Cleveland Heights being a busier suburb, there was a little bit of activity, and you could listen to that, and it kind of really drew me in. And for one of my school projects, I went to my cousin's graduation from the police academy, so it really pulled me in. But I was only 16, 17, so not old enough to really get involved in police work. So I was involved in music. So fast forward, my brother had spent 5 years, 5.5 years with Sammy Davis Jr. He tired of traveling, and he left the he decided to leave the road, and they asked him, do you have any recommendations for replacement? Well, naturally, he suggested me because I had been playing around Cleveland. I joined the musicians union when I was 16 and was playing professionally. I played some shows, so I had, since police work wasn't really something that my parents wanted me to get into. I went to school after I left high school. I went to a local community college. I started into electronics, which was something I was interested in, but I was flunking because I didn't have the head for the math. It was all arithmetic, and I just it wasn't really something that was in my heart, something I wanted to do. I wanted to either make a career in music or in police work. So basically, I really had two dreams, and they were both tugging at me. So it was kind of a little bit of a battle here, but since my brother recommended me for the to replace him as drummer for the Sammy Davis Jr. show, I got a call one day when I was struggling to make a decision from George Rhodes, who was Sammy Davis Jr.'s director, his music director, and I think my father kind of knew what was going on, but he let me, take the call, and basically I got a date to go to Minneapolis. This was 1981, January, and I thought it was going to be an audition, but before I hung up, I said, "Mr. Rhodes, am I going to audition during a rehearsal? Am I going to sit in during a rehearsal?" He said, "No, baby, you got the gig for 3 nights." It was like, oh my
Dang.
God, I can't believe this. I'm going to be playing the shows with Sammy Davis Jr. for 3 nights. So again, fast forward to the gig, I got all packed up, took my drums there and set up. And after the first show, they called me backstage. They called all of Mr. Davis's personal musicians back to his dressing room, and Sammy shook my hand and he said, "Man, you're a bitch of a player." And basically, I was hired. And I stayed on the road for 2.5 years until that other interest of mine, police work, pulled me off the road. And people thought, my family and friends thought I was really crazy for leaving a position at the top of an industry. I was playing drums for Sammy Davis Jr., who was, the greatest entertainer in the world, and I was traveling internationally all over, Europe and South America, Australia, Mexico, Las Vegas, Atlantic City. I was having a ball and getting a great education, but I really wanted to become a cop. So I left. And in the period of time that I was going to school, community college for criminal justice and law enforcement, I was working security at a department store, putting myself through school part-time. Um, I was also going back and starting to research my grandfather's murder. And that's how the whole thing started, of researching my connection and my roots in the Cleveland Mafia.
Wow. I mean, you definitely had a different background growing up, and you went through. I mean, you were at the top of that industry, and to just say, "Hey, you know what? I want to be a cop." I mean, there definitely had to be that strong power pulling you towards it because you knew what you wanted to do, and that sure as hell you did. How long were you on the force?
Uh, just a few months shy of 33 years. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So you went for it, man. You got it. You became a police chief or a lieutenant. What was it?
Well, I was eventually promoted to police chief in
Mhm.
2009, and I served as police chief for just over 10 years before I retired just over 3 years ago.
Wow. So I'm sure that was definitely a different thing for your family to have a police in a cop in the family. Am I
It
sure?
it it was, but it took a few years, and they kind of got used to it. You know, the music business, Adrian, it was really changing, especially in jazz, which my father grew up in. He had jazz groups when he was a drummer during the 50s and 60s before he got into the musicians union as an officer. He was also a barber. He worked a few different jobs. And so jazz was our thing, but it was changing. Even in Las Vegas in the 80s, the mid 80s, things were changing. Groups were coming in more self-contained. They brought in canned music. You know, you it was harder to make a living as a house musician. The business was just changing. So it wasn't really a bad decision that I made career wise to get into police work at the time. It wound up being a pretty good thing at the time. And then
Mhm.
on the side, sort of as an avocation, I got involved in writing about organized crime. And my first, you know, order of business, you might say, was to research, what was the story behind the murder of my grandfather and my three great uncles. And that's what led me to research and write my first book, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, which you read. And I appreciate you mentioning that you enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's definitely something that's a book of history that we needed. It's a history book of the Cleveland Mafia out there. And I don't think there's any book that can compare to that one that is for that section of the world, Cleveland. I don't think there's any books, about the mafia out there. Is there? I don't think there is.
Well, I think, back then when I was starting to research, the book came out in 1995, and
Wow. Yeah, it's
it's
been a while.
still a backlist seller. It's still selling, a few copies all these years later. But at the time, it was one of the first. There may have been the first sort of regional mob book, like not about New York, not about Chicago, not about Las Vegas. Because most people, when they would think about the mafia, at least back then, back in the 80s and even into the 90s, they would think of the five
Yeah.
families in New York. They would think of Chicago, the big Chicago outfit. They would think of the mafia's influence, of course, in Las Vegas. That was huge. That was a big story. Um, but you didn't hear a whole lot about all of the other crime families across the country,
Yeah.
the Midwest, and at one time, depending on how you count, there was roughly 2 dozen crime families, mafia families across the United States,
Hmm.
you know,
Yep.
including Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Milwaukee. So you had all these other stories that would be researched and come out in the form of books after the rise and fall of the Cleveland Mafia. And I think that book and my work sort of sparked that interest from great researchers that would come out and put a lot of work into researching their local or
Yep.
regional mob history and it eventually put these books out and they'd be published. So fortunately, we have those out there.
Yeah. I
Ton
mean,
of ton of stories.
someone had to start it. So, I mean, you could take credit for that. I think that's a very fair statement that,
Well, that's what I'm told.
yeah. Well, anyways, I would like to, talk about, when you're writing that book. So I mean, you had the interest for your grandfather, and then so you started researching. I mean, did it start with how the mafia first came to Cleveland, from, Italy or Sicily, or what was your first?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, they were immigrants, and there were the seven Porrello brothers, and like the key players, the seven Porrello brothers and the four Leonardo brothers. They were and the Leonardo name should in terms of organized crime history should ring really loud for anyone who's interested in the subject, because we had Big Angelo Leonardo, who in many years later, in fact, he really died not that long ago. He lived into his 90s, I believe. He might have been roughly 95 when he died. And at the time in 1983 or 1984, 85, around then, he was the highest ranking American mafia member to betray the Sicilian Code of Silence, Omerta, and go to work for the government as a cooperating witness. So that was a really big thing. This was before before Sammy the Bull Gravano and all those some of the other big names. But way back when, his father, Big Joe Leonardo, and his three brothers and the seven Porrello brothers, they came to the United States, eventually settled in Cleveland. And they, during Prohibition, they got involved in wholesaling corn sugar. Now, corn sugar, unlike cane sugar, which we have in our kitchens, corn sugar was less expensive and easier to ferment into corn liquor, which at the time was very popular in many big cities. And it was because it was popular, it was a lucrative ingredient. There was a lot of money to be made. And that's what, that's what these mob families look to do, and what the racketeers, the independent racketeers, look to do. Well, eventually they through eliminating competition, and especially the Leonardo family, they were a more powerful family. They had more organization, more firepower, and they were a little more connected with another group, the Mayfield Road Mob, which was kind of coming on strong. And so they were working together, the Leonardos and the Porrellos, and then a conflict began, which we call the Sugar War. And the Sugar War was kind of a series of interconnected battles, which could be traced to control over corn sugar. And it started in 1927 in the back of the Porrello barber shop, where a couple of the Porrello brothers and their employees cut hair. But the bulk of their the money that was made was really made in the back room, where they did liquor deals. Well, there was a meeting that took place that was scheduled to take place between the two Leonardo brothers, the main guys, Big Joe Leonardo and his brother John Leonardo, and then a couple of the Porrello brothers. Well, when the Leonardo brothers got there, they were set up, and a couple of gunmen came out, started shooting, and Big Joe and John Leonardo were killed. And that was a huge thing. The Porrellos were suspected. Now, they weren't indicted, but they were suspected. And that was the beginning of the Sugar War and bad blood between the Porrellos and the Leonardos. And the following year, Angelo Leonardo, who at the time was only 18 years old, or was actually 2 years later, 1929, he avenged his father's murder by killing the man responsible, who they believe was responsible for Big Joe Leonardo's murder, his father's murder. And his name was Salvador Tadero. And he was a business manager who was really good at organizing the books and managing the business. And he first worked for the Leonardos, and then after a conflict, he went to work for the Porrellos. So he had basically, the widely blamed for the murders of the Leonardo brothers and for sort of sparking the Sugar War. So, now you continue. Now there's associates who were murdered. The 2 years later. So now, well, in 27. So Joe Leonardo, who is known as the first boss of the Cleveland Mafia, so he's murdered. So now Joe Porrello, sort of the boss of his clan, he becomes the next boss of the Cleveland Mafia. He organizes what is known as the first known national meeting of the Sicilian American Mafia in the United States of America. And that's right here in Cleveland at the Statler Hotel. But they didn't get much business done, because there was a very alert foot patrolman who recognized or noticed, observed these suspicious looking characters coming in with very expensive looking clothing and luggage, pulling up in the expensive cars very early in the morning, and he reported back to headquarters, and they eventually raided the hotel and arrested these guys, and eventually booked them out, or sent them out of town. It was a big embarrassment for the Porrellos, and so the story continues, and it's sort of the beginning of the downfall of the Porrellos, but the bloodshed continued. You know,
Right.
was
And with I was gonna say, so with that busting, with them, wasn't those are some major figures that were the busted. I mean, it was like Al Capone, Joe Profaci, wasn't it, and Joe Magliocco.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Okay.
Profaci, who would eventually be a founder of one of the New York, one of the five New York crime families. And now Capone wasn't there because these were Sicilian Americans. Capone was not a Sicilian, but he was smart enough, and his organization was big enough in Chicago. I mean, it was huge, and his influence was huge, as we know. So he was able to send two of his associates who were Sicilian Americans to be represented at that meeting.
Mm,
So it was a big thing for the Porrellos to host this meeting, but they didn't have enough political influence to protect the meeting,
yeah.
law enforcement. So eventually, it really became an embarrassment for them.
Right. And these guys, from like Joe Porrello, I think he was even backed by the New York mob, like Joe Masseria. How you say it? Joe Masseria.
Joe Masseria, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so they definitely had their connections with the New York mob. And was that who they mainly worked with, or did they work with all kinds of different mafia crime families or whatever?
Well, I think they were mostly connected with the mobsters who had the most influence, and those were the guys with the bigger organizations in New York and Chicago. But they all had their connections, and I was never interested in getting that much in detail. I wanted to know the basic story, why
Right.
were these guys killed, and what was, and when I started researching, just a little aside, I went to the library, the wonderful public library. I mean, this was a wonderful resource back then. And I started with the date. All I had was the date of my grandfather's murder. I knew when he was killed. And I started going through the microfilm on these big machines. And back then it was all manual. You start winding the thing and going through, and you get to the date. Now, I didn't know anything about the story at this point, right? All I have is the date of his murder. So I didn't know whether it was going to be in section B or C or section A, if it was going to be on section 2 or 3 or section 1. Well, when I got to the date, the headlines just like shouted at me. It was huge. It said gang guns kill two Porellos and ally. My grandfather was killed with his brother. The two brothers were killed, and the ally was their bodyguard. And this was above the fold headlines, and two Porellos. It didn't have to say like two racketeers. It said two Porellos. So the name was known
Right.
enough at that point in 1932. So that was like a real eye opener for me, that wait a second, this is a lot bigger than I thought. So then, as I read through the article, I started writing down more dates, started looking up more articles, and pretty soon it was just a snowball effect. And then
Mhm.
I realized that this was not only a family history project, this was the beginning of the mafia in Cleveland. And then I got this bright idea, right? And I wasn't even that great of an English student in school, but I thought, I got to write a book about this, you know. And I don't know what possessed me to do that, but nothing in my mind told me that I couldn't do it, right? There was
Right.
nothing that I said, nothing came to me that said, wait, I can't do that. I thought, I got to write a book about this. This is the beginning of the mafia in Cleveland. This is huge. And I never had a thought that I can't do it. Now, I'm
No.
not saying that I have a positive attitude all the time. I have my self doubts and I have my negativity at times, often at times, you
Yeah.
know, I definitely have my self doubts. But at that time, I just didn't doubt that I could write that book, and it took 9 years.
No, I think that there's something about that, with these thoughts that come to your head. Because I had the same thing. I made a little documentary series about the American Mafia, and I watched a lot. I did a lot of research, before I even had this idea. I was just doing a lot of mafia interviews with a lot of guys that were a part of the life, and eventually I was like, hell, I can make my own, and sure as shit I did, and I haven't dropped it yet, but I just recently got done with it. But I was just laying in bed and just thinking and thinking and thinking, and boom, I had that thought in my head. And like you said, I've never had that self-doubt thought. I never did when I would get these ideas. So I know what you mean. I could definitely relate to that. So I mean that's good that you had that light bulb go off in your head and make this history book.
It did, and
So
at the time I didn't know, but there were key words, and I would use one of the words would become a theme as a police chief, and that was the word positivity. You hear negativity a lot, and negativity and cynicism that is common in police work because you're constantly dealing with people at their worst possible times. They're getting
absolutely.
arrested, they're dealing with a domestic violence situation, they have a child that died of an overdose, they got in an accident, someone got hurt bad. You're just dealing with people at their worst possible times. You also deal with people that are very thankful at the wonderful things that you can do and the services that you could provide, but it could be a negative atmosphere. So my theme would eventually, after a couple of years, I got myself situated as the police chief. It would always be positivity from the beginning when I would interview applicants for new positions, even into training and just in informal conversations. It was positivity. But as I was writing this book, it was like I said, I had no doubts that I couldn't do it. I knew I could do it, but there are other words too, because I talk to a lot of people that want to write books, they want to get published, and one of the other key words is commitment. It's like it's going to be a commitment,
Yeah.
and you're going to have to spend time. You're going to have to focus, and the other word is perseverance. You're going to have to persevere because I just published my fifth book last November. And there are times when I hate writing. It's drudgery, but I keep going, and eventually, and I'm going to bed at night, and it's like I can't wait to get up and get to that coffee shop and sit down and continue where I left off. You know,
Right.
so you kind of go in cycles, and you just have to, again, it's that perseverance and commitment to the project, and that's for someone working on their first book, it might be a little bit tougher.
Yeah, because you got to get the process down and everything like that. But I think
Right.
you're right. Doing anything like a big project definitely is a commitment. And there's going to be times where you're like, oh man, what the hell am I doing? And that's how I felt with that documentary series. But I couldn't wait. I would be sleeping or I'd try to go to bed, and I was like, damn, I want to be in there right now doing some more work. I can't
Yeah.
wait for tomorrow to come by, and I'm going to be recording and doing all this different stuff with it. So I know what you mean. I mean, it's
And I mean,
kind of.
your thing is invest in yourself. And I
Mhm.
mean, those words are all about investing in yourself. Commitment, perseverance, positivity, those are all about investing in yourself. When I wanted to become a cop and I had people, that thought I was really crazy for leaving the Sammy Davis Jr. show as a drummer, that was tough because I was young, I was impressionable, but I knew I wanted to become a cop, and so I had to persevere, and I had to make that commitment, and it didn't come easy too. You take entrance exams to become a police officer. You sit with other applicants. It's tougher now to get applicants because of the atmosphere against police officers, which I hate reading about and seeing that. But back then, you might have a Cleveland suburb, like a University Heights or a Lyndhurst or Beechwood or something. They might have one or two openings that are hiring for, but you'd be sitting with like 150 young men and women
Wow.
competing for those one or two spots.
Yeah.
So I think it was 17 entrance exams over a period of 3 years before my scores got high enough that I would be like in the top 10 that would get called in and eventually proceed through all of the different stages, you know,
Right.
to get hired. Because there's a lot you have to go through, the interview process, the polygraph thing, and medical exams, psychological exams, and the physical agility and all that. So finally, and I started having doubts. Maybe God's trying to tell me something. Maybe, maybe I've been given this talent in music. Maybe I'm supposed to stick with that. But
Well,
um,
I think
eventually,
if you want
eventually
something, you're
I
gonna
got
get it.
hired. I got hired by two places. I got hired part time in one place at like 10 in the morning, and then I got hired full time at 2 in the afternoon. And I had to call the place that I had accepted the part time employment and tell them I had to resign. I hadn't even started really because I got full-time employment. So that's how it
Um,
happened. I'm sorry, I
yeah.
interrupted you. What did you say, Adrian?
Oh, I was just saying, if you want something, you're gonna make sure it happens, and that's what you did for putting in all that. I mean, all them hours and all them time trying to get it, all them tries. But sure as shit, you did it. You made it to the chief of police. You know what I mean? So not a lot of people can say that, and you
Well, if you want
definitely did.
something and it's a good thing, if you want
Right.
something and it's a good thing, I think the world kind of the world kind of can work in your favor.
Yeah.
Um,
Before we do wrap up, I wanted to discuss like what was your grandfather's ultimate death? Did you find out?
I did. He was the youngest, and he was a real dapper, hothead of the brothers. He was the youngest one. He was killed, interestingly, with the oldest brother. The youngest brother and the oldest brother were killed together, and there were threats 2 years after the murders of their two other brothers who were killed in 1930. And they kind of had gone into hiding. Well, when they emerged from hiding, they were still talking about avenging their brother's murders. And so I think what happened is the Mayfield Road mob, um, it was the Milano brothers, Frank and Tony Milano, and Al Palizzi, who would eventually become the main Cleveland Mafia, in the 1930s. And then in the 1940s, eventually you'd have a guy by the name of John Scalish, who would become the mafia boss here in Cleveland and be the boss through till 1976. But back then, I think because the two brothers were still speaking about avenging the murders of their brothers 2 years earlier, they were considered a risk. And so the Mayfield Road mob, I think the theory is, and I really believe that it's true, they decided to go after them and kill them. And I think that's what happened. So they were killed while they were playing cards at a cigar and soda shop at 110th and Woodland, which, interesting, had become known as the Bloody Corner on the east side of Cleveland because there were numerous mob-related and bootleg-related murders there. And they were killed along with their bodyguard.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I mean, no one was ever indicted or anything for that. Then I'm assuming.
No, there was one indictment that came out of the murder, and that was Frank Brancato, who was a gunman, sort of an independent gunman. He wasn't charged for the murders, but he was charged for perjury because one of the guys, not the older brother, he was a little bit heavier and older, so he was slower. But either the bodyguard or possibly my brother, one of the two got off a shot. Frank Brancato was hit. Well, he went to the west side for treatment, stumbled into a hospital, and he lied to the police about where he was shot because they traced the bullet to one of the guns that was left at the scene of the murders on the east side. So he
Oh,
was indicted and tried and convicted of perjury, spent some time in prison. And in later years, he went on to become pretty well respected, sort of a mafia lieutenant rank in Cleveland, and lived into the I think the early 1970s. Frank Brancato, yeah.
wow. Yeah, now I do recall that from the book. I mean, when you go into detail with all your stuff, I mean, that's just so easy to follow along with the book. I mean, everything has a great timeline. Everything's where it's supposed to be, I think, because the way you structured it is just, you can just follow it along so easily as if, because there's just all kinds of different things going on. But the way that you had the timelines and stuff, I think it
Yeah,
was perfect, man.
I know there's a lot of names involved, and I do get dinged for that in reviews sometimes. And I've sort of learned from that. That is my first book, so I've kind of learned. Like I said, I've written 5 books now, so with each book, I've learned sometimes if I'm only going to mention a name, maybe one time, I'll try and eliminate the name. But this was about Cleveland. It was, it was important to me that
Yeah.
it was part of that history, and I think it's got an important place in Northeast Ohio history, and for anyone that's interested in the history of organized crime in the country.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, do you have any things you want to promote before we end?
Sure, all of my books, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've there's a lot of good things happening. Of course, Kill the Irishman was probably my claim to fame, because that was adapted for film, for the motion picture To Kill the Irishman, which came out in 2011. There's a producer by the name of Tommy Reed, back when the book came out, who took an interest and sort of marshaled that project through, and it came out in 2011 with a great cast of talent. But my last book, my most recent title, is called There's More Bodies Out There. It's a little bit different of a story. It's sort of organized crime meets true crime, and it's about it's Pittsburgh mobbed up serial killer and a cop, pal of his, who during the 70s and 80s were responsible for, well, the main character, Richard Henkel, was believed responsible for numerous murders, and the cop was never indicted, but he was a suspect suspected by the investigators of being involved with Henkel. It's a multi-layered story. It's not a real long read, but I'm very excited about it, and looking at the theatrical potential for that one too. Got a lot of things happening. Another book, Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. There's almost too much to mention, but I've got a website, rickporrello.com. I've got all my books on there. If anyone's interested, they could go to the website and look at my book. But I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely put your website link in the description, because that's where all your books, people can get them, or can they get them on Amazon as well, or any platforms?
They could look at the books on my website. They can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble. They're pretty much most of the platforms. I always encourage people too to go to their local bookstore, and if they don't have it on the shelf, there's a good chance that they can, and they probably won't, unless they won't have it on the shelf unless it's in Northeast Ohio, but they could probably order it for them if they're inclined to go to their local bookstore. I always encourage people to support their stores in their neighborhood. But yeah, so many people shop online. They can get them online too.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely be able to put all that in the video description, and I just want to thank you again so much for coming on and sharing your story, man.
You're welcome. I appreciate your interest.
Rick's family was connected to the Cleveland Mafia. What a funny coincidence this is. His family was involved with the mob, and Rick was completely opposite. He was involved with law enforcement and went on to become an author. Lots of people can learn from his story. Just because your family was involved with crime doesn't mean you have to. Please comment any key takeaways that you got from this interview. Please share it with anyone that you think will enjoy this interview. Also, please don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to get more interviews like this. I'll put Rick's website in the video description so you can check out all of his books, and at the end of this video there'll be a playlist that pops up of all my other Mafia related interviews. Thank you again for watching.